Dramatic evidence of medical fraud seems to undermine the case for ivermectin as a COVID-19 treatment. The EU launches its massive Green Deal plan and braces itself for backlash, and Britons are being forced into quarantine by an out-of-control app while being told to eat algae. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. Something of a major development in the whole ivermectin story. It turns out that the one study most responsible for all the positive stories about the drug's suggested value in treating COVID-19 might have never even happened at all. In other words, could have been out-and-out fraud. Independent researchers recovered the data for the algae study from Egypt and found that it showed all the signs of having been completely faked. The paper has now been retracted by the preprint publisher where it was being hosted for ethical concerns. The algae study claimed to be a randomised controlled trial, and a sizable one at that, which is why it was held to have been an important piece of evidence in the promotion of ivermectin as a treatment for COVID-19. It suggested that patients with the disease treated in hospital with ivermectin early in their infection saw substantial improvement and a reduction in mortality by 90%, which was a startling result, putting ivermectin as a contender for most effective treatment ever discovered. Those of you who watched my recent update on ivermectin will remember that there were two papers covered in the most positive meta-analyses that were rated as high quality and free from bias, but which at least one independent researcher had said on the contrary seemed to be low quality. Well, this was one of those two papers, and I reported then that if those papers were removed from the study, and indeed if just this one paper is removed from the study, then it completely affects the results, changing a substantial benefit from treatment with ivermectin to no benefit in one meta-analysis and benefit outside of statistical significance in the other, according to epidemiologist Bjorn Meyerowitz-Katz. Writing on his Medium blog, Meyerowitz-Katz said that given the amount of ivermectin that has been prescribed now in different parts of the world, mostly in developing countries where there's no access to alternatives, the fraud, if fraud it turns out to be, could be the most consequential medical fraud ever committed. And the problem was uncovered not by the medical establishment, but by a British master's student, Jack Lawrence. Lawrence noted something odd about the paper in that the entire introduction seemed to have been plagiarised. That got him looking at it more closely and seeing that some of the numbers were incredibly unlikely. For instance, they would only have come out the way they did if about 80% of the patients stayed in the hospital for exactly 9 or 25 days. And that led him to look at the actual data, which was locked. That wasn't such a problem. Tip for data fraudsters, don't use 1234 as your password. So he guessed a few easy passwords and got that one and got in. The data has patients who were supposedly hospitalised before the trial even started, contrary to what was reported. Large numbers of the patient details seem to be clones of each other, all apparently classic hallmark signs of scientific fraud. Science fraud expert Nick Brown was asked to look at the paper, and he detailed his findings on his blog, as well as giving unlocked access to the data. It's a rather extensive blow-by-blow account, but well worth a read. In spite of the fact that the paper hadn't been peer-reviewed, it was hugely influential at a time when studies were being done so quickly that preprints had been given more prominence and more weight than in normal times. Hence, it had already been cited by 30 other studies, including those highly influential meta-analyses and other peer-reviewed papers in the influential journals. It had been downloaded over 100,000 times. This development rather reinforces my previous position, though we need to see what comes from the large-scale clinical trials that are currently underway. To all those people who slated me for talking about doubts about the existing low-quality trials, well, this is it. This is rather why you don't just leap to assumptions based on what you wish would be true. And to the person who said to me that the Oxford trial was being set up to fail, because didn't they know that the treatment has to be done early on? Well, that provision depended entirely on the paper that has just been discredited. So no, that study's progressing entirely correctly without preconceptions based on the say-so of a preprint paper. Now, obviously, it would still be highly desirable if the studies came back with good news about ivermectin. But there's a test coming up. How reliable you should hold the advocates of ivermectin to be comes down to some extent to how openly they respond to this development. People who are dug into their trench and no longer following the evidence to form their view will, out of hand, very quickly dismiss this as having no significance. Those that are genuinely evidence-led will acknowledge the importance of this and re-evaluate carefully to see where it leaves the body of evidence. For those advocates, these developments aren't exactly hopeful, but it ain't over till it's over. But the real reckoning, as Meyerowitz-Katz points out, comes home to roost with the wider scientific community. He concluded it like this: it should not take a master's student investigative journalist looking at a study to notice that it's potentially fraud. This study was reviewed by dozens of scientists, including myself, and while I said it was extremely low quality, even I didn't notice the issues with the data. It has been more than 6 months since this study was put online. By all signs, the results of the research have been used to treat thousands or perhaps millions of people across the world. And yet, until now, no one noticed that most of the introduction is plagiarized. The scientific community, we noble defenders of truth, have well and truly cocked it up. Speaking of incompetence with medical consequences, Britain's chaotic progress towards what we might now call sort of Freedom Day continued. Various institutions are complaining of massive disruption because of the so-called pingdemic, with the NHS Test and Trace app reportedly pinging neighbours through walls, otherwise alerting them to contact with people that they've never actually met. Factories such as those of Rolls-Royce are facing shutdown, bin collections halted, guests in hotels being told to clean their own rooms as large numbers of staff get told to isolate by technology that is apparently out of control. Reportedly, 1 in 5 staff in hospitality and retail are currently self-isolating. It's a scene that you should probably put to the music of the Benny Hill theme tune, but unfortunately it's no laughing matter to those that have been caught up in it. Suggestions that the Track and Trace app was going to be desensitised, at least in some token attempt to reduce the chaos, even that was inexplicably put on hold for a number of weeks. And I say inexplicably, actually it came with an explanation. It was put on hold because of the rising number of cases, which was kind of the whole point, surely. I mean, we're opening up because the majority are double vaccinated and those that are left are not highly vulnerable. We always knew that meant there was going to be an increase in cases, which is why you don't want everyone being pinged all the time into 10-day quarantines the second they step outside their door. As I said last week, you can argue that people should stay locked up, you can argue that they should be let free, but this is the worst of all worlds. And it's obvious it's creating chaos and they still are not changing it. What will they do next, you have to wonder? Let's pour a stiff drink and await with interest. Now, in a minute, we'll get to some of the rest of the week's news, including the huge potential backlash coming from over-ambitious climate policy. But first, one of the distinctive voices on the climate change debate is that of Bjorn Lomborg. Skeptics and so-called lukewarmers love him. Climate campaigners are reduced to puddles of fury by him. In his latest book, False Alarm, Lomborg repeats what has been his most distinctive argument, that the climate change policies put forward today are incredibly bad value, spending $1 for just 11 cents of climate benefit. He argues that, although climate change is a problem that should be addressed, the projected economic scenarios show that our optimum response doesn't involve net zero by 2050, but instead a much more gradual approach. He argues that we should focus on maximising wealth creation, easier with fossil fuels, he says, and therefore the ability to adapt to climate change. His critics say that his numbers don't add up, that he misquotes his sources and indulges in wishful thinking at best. Well, is he right? Are his critics right? And either way, should we be getting more robust challenge about the value of the policies being pushed through by governments in different parts of the world right now? That's what I'll be looking at in the video to go live on this channel on Monday next week, 7 PM UK time. See you then. The European Commission launched a major package of new laws in the name of setting the EU on course to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 55% in the next 10 years and to reach net zero by 2050. The so-called Fit for 50 programme. And it looks to initiate a massive revamp on how people travel, insulate and heat their homes, manufacture things and manage their forests and land. It'll include a social fund to shield poor and vulnerable households from rising fuel prices to try to fend off what is feared to be a major pushback on a hugely ambitious programme. According to Frans Timmermans, the Executive Vice President of the European Commission, the EC is very aware that if it gets the balance wrong, it may well spark a continent-wide rebellion. But that's okay. Massive, sprawling bureaucracies never get these sorts of things wrong. I'm sure it'll be fine. A big feature of this is the return of the EU's efforts on carbon trading. The bloc instigated an emissions trading scheme back in 2005. A carbon cap and trade scheme capped the emissions at a set level and gave permits to pollute that were then traded. Now, the theory behind such a system is that those companies that can most easily reduce their emissions will do so and then sell their permits to those whose ability to reduce is much more constrained. And it's a good principle in theory. And in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice, they made a total pig's ear of it. They produced a glut of cheap permits and such an unambitious emissions cap. Nobody had to change much of anything to meet it, particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. But they say they've learned the lessons. German MEP Peter Liese said, "People lost trust in the ETS because it didn't work. Now it works." So the new version will extend the scheme from the original 40% of emissions to most emissions, making it more expensive for industries such as steel and cement. Numbers of permits will be squeezed, with the expected effect of pushing up the price of emitted carbon from around €50 per tonne to around €100 per tonne over the next decade. And part of making this work will be the plan by the EU to tax imports from countries that are higher emitters of carbon, because you don't want to simply move carbon-intensive processes overseas with carbon pricing at home that then doesn't affect your foreign competitors. Unsurprisingly, that also becomes a point of some tension. Australia, for instance, has strongly attacked the proposal for a carbon border tax, saying that the move would be protectionist and in breach of global trade rules. Trade Minister Dan Tehan said the EU was unilaterally imposing its views and its ways on other countries. That's a local difficulty compared to the potential for a carbon trade war between the EU and the US. For all that President Biden has promised big on climate action, the truth is that the EU's carbon border proposals would see the US as being in the groups currently lacking aggressive carbon reduction policies. And they're not entirely wrong about that. So how Biden responds to the threat of tariffs is a real dilemma for him. He has the terrible optics of hitting back against more progressive climate policies than his own, but likewise he'll be under huge pressure to either retaliate with tariffs of his own, very much the Trump playbook, remember, or to challenge the EU by taking it to the somewhat dysfunctional World Trade Organization's dispute resolution body. On the one hand, you have Colin O'Mara, CEO of the National Wildlife Federation and described as close to the White House team, asking, "Are we really going to let an unelected international body dictate whether we act on climate and jobs? That would be insane." Sounds a bit Brexit-y to me, but let's not go there. But then you have others pointing out that the Biden administration had been dealing with rhetoric that it would lead the world on climate policy and therefore put exactly that sort of pressure on everyone else. The EU may be an unelected bureaucratic body and its programme may be set up to fail. Watch this space. But it is certainly highlighting the gulf between the US Democrats' rhetoric and their ability to actually get stuff done. In response, the US might focus on wielding the Trump tariffs on EU steel and aluminium production because US steel manufacturing currently produces fewer greenhouse gases than its foreign competitors. That would certainly be an interesting turnaround for sure. It's worth noting the other reason why emissions trading schemes are getting a momentum boost this week. The day that this video goes live is the launch day for the Chinese carbon emissions trading scheme. It will only cover the power sector on launch, but even that will make it larger than the EU's former scheme, and it will cover 12% of global emissions. Meanwhile, in the UK, we're being told that to save the planet, we should eat algae. Yum! Well, okay, that's a bit reductive to be fair. Ethical restaurateur Henry Dimbleby presented a report commissioned by the UK government on the National Food Strategy. He was asked to paint a vision for overhauling agriculture and diet. Critics have suggested that what's come back is mostly a rehash of things that people have already been calling for and debating for some time, such as a tax on sugar and also on salt to try to tackle the obesity problem. And of course, as always, the suggestion was there that people need to cut down on eating meat in the name of climate change. Britain should be encouraged to eat fermented plant protein and other tasty alternatives, he argued. Interestingly, though, he's not recommending a meat tax. Apparently that was floated in a number of focus groups and it was met with immediate hostility, leading him to sadly conclude that it would be politically impossible. I'm fairly sure I've noted that before on this channel, even without the benefit of a bunch of focus groups. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has already said that he's not attracted to the idea of sugar and salt taxes. It's not clear where that leaves the whole operation. Now, in other news, the head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Ghebreyesus, said that it was premature to rule out a possible lab leak being the cause of the COVID-19 pandemic. Not only that, but he went further than he has before in implicitly criticizing China for its lack of cooperation with the WHO investigative team. He said that the WHO is asking actually China to be transparent, open and cooperate, especially on the information, raw data that we asked for at the early days of the pandemic. I was a lab technician myself. I'm an immunologist and I have worked in the lab and lab accidents happen. It's common. However, right now there are no current plans for any follow-up investigative mission to Wuhan following the much criticised operation early this year. And of course China, as you know, has said that it's cooperated enough, thank you very much, it's time for you to start looking elsewhere. The move came in the same week as the British Medical Journal published an editorial calling for a proper inquiry, along with an article that looked frankly about how a plausible theory ended up being labelled as a conspiracy theory. Now, none of this comes because of any new information that makes a lab leak more likely, and in some ways that's actually kind of the point. Apologies to those of you that may have seen recent videos in rather less than full high definition glory. On Monday in particular, the high definition version took 3 hours to process, and up until the time it did, the only definition you could see the video in was 360 pixels. Now, depending on how high resolution your screen is, that would be like watching me through glasses smeared with Vaseline, which, you know, might improve your viewing experience for all I know. It's not how it's meant to be. I gather that other YouTube creators have complained about the same problem, so for the time being, I'm just going to have to try to upload earlier, which, you know, might be no bad thing anyway. Also, I replied to a fragment of a comment this week from user Uncommon Sense. I saw the notification for his comment, which urged me to set up a channel on Odyssey, which I have, by the way. The link's always in the description below. But that comment didn't exist anymore when I went to answer it. This seems to be happening a lot. It's kind of getting on my nerves. So for the time being, I'm going to start doing the following in the interest of transparency. Every video, I do a pinned tweet giving my rules for commenting here. I occasionally remove abusive comments, although I haven't had to do that for quite a long time. From now on, if I remove a comment, I will add a notification that I did that to that pinned comment. Likewise, if I notice a notification and find that the comment doesn't exist when I get there, then I will mention that as well. If you do find that you have a disappearing comment, it might well be worth trying to repeat it as a reply to my pinned comment. Although some have said they did that and it still disappeared, there's certainly been a couple that did that and found that when they did it that way, it stuck around. Okay, after all that, just time for one quick question. Can you or scientists explain that having gone through almost 2 years of reduced travel and manufacturing, tourism, etc., carbon dioxide emissions continue to rise while the world's temperature haven't moved? I guess this was prompted by talk of the heat dome, although I've never said anything about predicted impacts on climate change from COVID lockdowns. And that is sort of the point. Nobody that I'm aware of has ever said that a couple of years of reduced travel would mean that CO2 emissions wouldn't continue to rise. If you look at a breakdown of which sectors contribute which percentages to emissions, unsurprisingly, the power sector contributes the most. And we weren't all sat in freezing cold homes, so you can take it that power stations across the world continued operating. Same for much of the manufacturing sector and the transport sector that transported those goods. It only didn't really function to take people on holidays and stuff. So of course, the rate of emissions slowed slightly, but hardly at all. Exactly what you would expect. People who say, oh, net zero will mean people being locked up permanently. Well, no, it won't, because A, that would not be a programme that people would put up with, for one thing, even if people wanted it, which apart from Roger Hallam, I don't think anybody does. But even if they did, it wouldn't solve the problem. Innovating and implementing zero carbon energy has to happen before you make a proper dent. And that's not going to happen overnight, whatever Roger or even Greta might wish. This week I did another video with an update on the discussion around ivermectin, which, as you'll have seen, is already slightly out of date, although its cautious stance has been somewhat validated. As I made that video, I was aware that YouTube specifically names the promotion of ivermectin in its community standards as something you must not do. Right now, I don't think that's a problem for me because I don't promote things here that much. I just look at what the evidence does or doesn't support and talk about it. But it's still worth asking the question, why on earth not? Whether it comes to possible issues with vaccines or not, or the sensible public policy approach to dealing with a pandemic, or what might be drawbacks to suggested climate change policy. Whether we're encouraged to talk about these things seems to come down to the likely impact on the public's willingness to support a course of action. It's as though we don't get to hear the news anymore, we just get to hear what a media organisation thinks we need to hear to keep us on the straight and narrow.
There's a difference between knowing the path and walking the path.
It means that almost every discussion now has taken on a highly fraught moral temperature. Now, of course, look, sometimes we do need everyone to do something in concert. I mean, we expect that if we were fighting a war in defence of our own national sovereignty. And maybe we should expect that in a pandemic. I mean, there's certainly a strong rationale for it if the pandemic is highly deadly. This week, France's President Macron confronted the refusal of his citizens to play their part by floating that vaccination would become next to mandatory. I mean, you didn't have to get jabbed if you didn't want to, unless, of course, you wanted to go to any restaurant, attend any event, really do anything much at all. In many ways in France, that's a self-inflicted wound, because for political reasons, Macron himself fueled doubts over the AstraZeneca vaccine, and he did so knowing that his nation was already the most vaccine hesitant of any in Europe. I don't think we'll see that sort of authoritarianism in most of the countries. Simply put, political leaders know that they wouldn't get away with it. But that leaves us with that softer cultural consensus, that freedom of speech is now to be measured purely in terms of how much it furthers the good of society, not by robust questioning, but tacit support for the line. But the whole point in a democracy is that you benefit from robust questioning. The whole benefit is that your plans are forced to be better because they get vigorously attacked. Even when the questions lead to dead ends, even when they're ideas that are demonstrably wrong and unhelpful. Having the right to question every topic of importance is the very thing that makes our society worth living in. There should be no off-limits questions. Full stop. Now, speaking of asking questions, I took the initiative this week and asked a question of YouTube. Why is this channel no longer having videos recommended to non-subscribers since the start of March? One commenter confirmed this for me this week, saying that he'd watched YouTube from a device that wasn't logged in. I have searched your videos in the account that is not logged in, and whilst I have had other similar videos I've searched for by the same creators suggested, never yours. And I've had a number of similar comments from people who have seen things likewise. And that just confirms what those graphs I showed you last week demonstrated. 0 views coming from YouTube recommendations and views for non-subscribers. I shared those graphs with the YouTube support operative. The person I was talking to acknowledged that it looked like a problem. So that's progress, at least. He said it would take proper investigation and he's forwarded it on to the correct internal team. That was Monday. This is Friday. I still await their response with slightly less than bated breath. But it's important to assume that such things could be down to a good faith algorithmic mistake. Just coincidence that it kicked in after I covered a couple of controversial topics. Coincidences happen in the world all the time. You just never know. What isn't a coincidence is that this channel keeps going thanks to the good people who support it on Patreon. Thanks to them, I can commit the time to make videos every week. I can continue to talk about whatever topics seem most important, regardless of whether the questions there are welcomed or not. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to create here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.